and Denny Chambers, clarinetist, composer, and founder of Clarinet Playground, also recently moved back to Colorado. So I am here in Longmont and accepting students in the Boulder, Longmont, maybe Loveland areas. But for now, we're going to dive into the Colorado All-State Audition music for 2023 and 2024. This video will cover all materials required for the audition, starting with the etudes. You can skip ahead to each section so you can spend as much time as you want with each task. We'll start with Rose 32, number 6, the technical one. Directly taken from the All-State page, metronome markings are recommended targets, not requirements, and performing at a slower tempo with greater accuracy and expression may result in a higher score. Please keep that in mind, especially when you're thinking about the fast etude. We want it to be clean. So my reminders are we want to aim for a steady pulse, accurate rhythm, clean and crisp articulation, and we need to add some shaping ideas. Let's start by listening first. Now we're going to break some things down, starting with rhythm. When you initially look at this page, it's just all 16th notes. So you might think, oh, this is going to be easy, it's just 16th notes. But we have to be really, really steady and accurate with that rhythm. We want it to be very, very smooth, but also like really, really even. So you've got to work with your metronome. So constant 16th notes, are they fast? Well, they're really only fast based on your tempo choice. So whatever tempo you choose will determine the speed of your 16th notes. If you feel like it's too fast and you're tumbling down a hill out of control, then you're too fast. You've got to start slowly. Now let's take a look at fingerings. So we want to really study the music ahead of time and make your choices. Mark them into the music, and then if you change your mind, erase them and mark them again. Now I'll share my fingering choices for this etude. You can take some of my ideas or leave them, whatever works for you, but you do need to make some choices. So I tend to favor the right side, so I like to play that first B in measure 1 on the right side. So that is everything down plus that right pinky, register key of course. And then I also like to play the C sharp on the right. Like I said, I favor the right side. Measure 2, I also play right C sharp, right B. In measure 3, just a quick reminder that we want to use the middle finger for that particular F sharp. And then if you look at the end of measure 3 and 4, think, what would you do here? Are you going to do right side for your C sharps? When you go to A sharp to B, do you want to do like pinky, pinky B both sides? Do you want to do right side B? So there's some choices that you can make in that area. And if we look down at measure 5, we have CBC, CB natural C. I like to do that on the right side. And the PP stands for pinky, pinky. Because you're going CBC, there's no reason to trade the pinkies. So you can do that with both pinkies. And then measure 6 is where we run into a conundrum. So we have F sharp, E sharp, F sharp right after a C. So some people will want to go straight to your side key. So you go C, side key, let go for thumb, back to side key, and then up to A. But if you're going at a pretty quick clip, you might want to go first finger for that first F sharp, flip to your thumb, and then do the side key. And it really just depends on how efficient you are with that. You might try it both ways and see what works for you. Then coming out of that, you want to choose. Do I want to do right side C sharp, left side C sharp? Mostly because in measure 7, that's where I would definitely play left C sharp first, right C, and then pinky, pinky B. Sort of following your typical chromatic pattern because that's a little bit of a chromatic snippet there. So then you back up to measure 6 and you think, okay, how do I want to set myself up there? Do I want to start on that left C sharp, so you're left, up, E, D, left again? Or are you more comfortable on the right there and then switching to the left later? All kinds of things that you want to consider and make sure you're comfortable with. When you look at measure 8, we've got the low F sharp. Again, I favor the right side, so I like to do this one. And I do have a reason, because if you think about going from A to F sharp, you have that little skip. And I think we're going to be a little bit cleaner if all the motion is in one hand. So A down to F sharp here might be cleaner than trying to coordinate fingers of 2 hands going to the left side. Then measure 9 again, I like to choose the right side B. But really at that point you want to think, okay, I'm going to do either right or left. If you do pinky pinky B, you could run into some troubles. So like pinky pinky B after a G and then a D, you could accidentally have a little blip of a scale in there. If you do it on the right or the left side only, then you won't run into that problem at all. Measure 10 is just straight down the scale, very straightforward. Same thing with 11. After the C, you can do pinky pinky B coming down the scale. Measure 12, you can do pinky pinky B, then up to C. And then 13, 14, this is where again you can choose right side or left side, but not both for those Bs. Then we come down to measure 15, we start to have this chromatic descent. Make sure you're doing fork for your F sharp and then F natural. That way we avoid that little flip-flop potential blip. And that's all chromatic. So then of course we get the left D flat, right C, pinky pinky B. And then in measure 17, A flat, G, side key F sharp. That's your thumb and your bottom two side keys. And then F, E, and then you choose what B you want to play and finish out the excerpt. So since the rhythm is all 16th notes and you might think, oh, this is easy, this is where articulation is going to come into play because there are tons of different articulation patterns here. We've got some really long slurs. We have slur 4s, slur 3s, and slur 2s. We want to make sure we are very, very clear when it's a 3 versus a 2. And we do have some missing staccato. So if it's not marked, if there's no slur marking, assume it's staccato unless it's the very last note of the excerpt, the D. That long D quarter note, of course, you're going to play that full value. But like in that last measure, if you see the F sharp and A, there's no marking there. But assume it's staccato. We want to keep the style consistent. So we're going to spend some time here on articulation. Here are some practice ideas I'll go through. So clipping is something that you can do to really make sure your staccato notes are nice and crisp. I think about a staccato note as an island. It needs space before and space after. So if we clip the note before it, we get that little extra bit of silence before the staccato note. So I think about clipping, I just literally put my tongue back onto the reed and continue to blow, but I'm clipping it off to create that space for the staccato to have space before and after the note. I'll show you where you can do it. The very beginning, you'll see slur 3 and then staccato 1. The third note, we want to clip off. We want to add our tongue back to the reed, create some silence and space so that that D is nice and crisp. And you'll see slur 3 tongue 1, slur 3 tongue 1. And then in measure 2, you see some slur 2s, and they are on the offbeat. So in that particular case, we do lift a little bit. But then if you look at the end of that first line where it says no clipping, you have slur 2s, but they're on the strong beat. In that case, I would play those smoother and more connected. But the very last one of that I would clip because leading into the second line, you have a staccato note. So I'm going to play this in slow motion so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So first I'll show you what a clip sounds like. I'll just play the first 3 notes and put my tongue on the reed. While my tongue is on the reed, that's when I'm going to move my fingers to the staccato note. So it's like you're moving ahead while your tongue is on the reed. The next step is to actually play that staccato note. And then you can continue this idea. I'll do it very dramatically so you can really hear it, and then I'll do it a little bit more gently. Now if we practice the slurred patterns only, it helps you not only focus on where you can clip and where you don't clip, but also it separates things out like little puzzle pieces. I'm just going to practice the slurs, and then later we'll just practice the staccato notes. great challenge for your brain. So now we'll do staccato only. Hopefully you can follow along because there are way fewer notes that are just staccato. So 1, 2, ready, and. So admittedly, that is really tough. The next thing we'll do is a little easier. So now we're going to be putting some things together. So if you think about puzzle pieces, we want to have really good connectors. So if you think about, well, I'm just going to practice 4 16th notes at a time. Well, we really need to connect them. So think 4 plus 1. Then the next group of 4 plus 1. And that way you always have a connection, you always have a direction, and you know where you're headed next. We'll do 4 plus 1 first, and then 8 plus 1. I'll just do like the first line. Practicing with 4 plus 1 and 8 plus 1 also makes you really focus on the metronome. I found myself getting ahead a few times, so it helps you to define exactly where the beats are and divide them very well. Now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about looking for patterns. So patterns help us recognize groups of notes. If we're only thinking this note and then that note and then this note, it's a very scattery way of learning. But if we notice patterns, it makes things so much easier. So if you're already practicing scales and arpeggios, this is going to be very helpful to you. So the first thing I might look for is scale motion. So if you see in measure 3, starting on the first note, we have a scale motion downward in the key of G major. Very simple. And on the second line in measure 7, we have what I like to call a combination scale. It's not quite chromatic, it's not quite major, and those can be very hectic to learn so that you can isolate that one. Then at the end of measure 8, we have a scale going up, just F sharp up to the G, nice G major scale. Then in measure 10, we're going down the G major scale, and then we have a little jump up in an arpeggio figure, and at the end of 11, another scale descending pattern. Then the final scale is measure 15, a chromatic scale. I just used the highlighter, so that is all chromatic, that entire sequence there. Then we can practice these things together in one session, so I'm going to hit all the scale motion areas. Now I'm going to find chords. So in measure 2, we have a G major arpeggio right at the end. And in measure 8, we have this D major with an added minor 7th chord going downward. At the end of measure 9, we have the G major chord with a major 7. At the beginning of measure 11, we have an F sharp diminished chord. At the beginning of 12, we have B major plus a minor 7. And then D major plus a minor 7. In measure 13, we have E minor chord. 14, A major chord plus a minor 7. 25, D major chord. And the very last measure, another D major chord. Now, if you're into music theory, you're going to really love this. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, it's okay. But it's nice to be aware of what chords am I playing. Okay, at the beginning we have a G major chord. So if you practice G major arpeggios, that's the notes that are going to be in that arpeggio. So it's just helpful to know where those chords are. And in my opinion, that's where the tough parts are in the etude. So if you can isolate those chords, it can really help you prepare, and all the stuff around it gets a little bit easier. The next thing I want to point out are the neighbor groups. So a neighbor group is where you have your basic note. Maybe it's decorated by a lower chromatic neighbor, a lower neighbor, or maybe even an upper neighbor, and then that initial note comes back. So if you look in measure 1, we have a G decorated by a lower chromatic neighbor F sharp, and then we go back to G. And then we have a D decorated by a lower neighbor C sharp, lower chromatic neighbor C sharp, and then back to D. So if we look at all those neighbor groups in measure 2, now we have sort of an incomplete neighbor group where we start on the lower neighbors. We have F sharp G, C sharp D. Those are neighbor groups. In measure 3, we have more of those 2 neighbor groups, C sharp D, A sharp B, F sharp G, C sharp D, A sharp B. And then in measure 5, we're back to the 3 note groups, C, B, C, A, G sharp A, F sharp E sharp F sharp, D, C sharp D. We can isolate those for practice too. It's very helpful for the ear. The final step in really breaking this apart is looking to simplify. When we simplify, we have a greater understanding of the structure of the piece. And if we take a look at this one, and now that we know that those neighbor groups are really just arpeggios, that first measure is a G chord. Measure 2 is a G chord. Measure 3 is a G major chord. Measure 4, that entire first line is just a big G major chord. So now if we look at measure 5, we're mostly built on F sharp. Measure 6, another F sharp, but the chord has slightly changed, so now we have a D thrown in there. Then measure 7 is basically E. Measure 8 is D and then an F sharp. Measure 9 is G, leading to 10, which is also G, F sharp, D sharp, E, C sharp, D, and then D. Notice that this has transitioned from G major to D major by the time you get to the end of the excerpt. The music theory nerds are going to love this. If this is all new to you, it's okay. We're just sort of picking out what is the main note in each measure. I'm going to play this very simplified version just for your ear. So by breaking all of this stuff apart, the theory and the hope, and actually it really does work, is when you put it all back together, things just make more sense. You see groups and patterns more than you see these individual sort of plunked out notes. It's going to help you have a better flow as you go through it. Next thing is tuning. Yes, you're by yourself, but you still need to be in tune. Make sure you tune with a tuner. You check your tendencies. Maybe your upper notes are flat. Maybe your lower notes are sharp. Make sure you pull in different areas and you're listening and you're working on your tuning. You can check with a tuner, you can practice with a drone, and we can actually use the stuff we learned in this previous break apart section, use that knowledge to choose drones. So like at the very beginning, that entire first line, you could choose a G or a concert F, right? Concert F drone, and just have that playing in the background while you play. You can also just have your tuner right in front of you and check all the pitches. Maybe your high Bs are a little sharp, and you put a little arrow downward on any notes that are sharp. Maybe the flat ones, you put a little arrow upward just to remind you, raise your eyebrows, let's get that pitch up a little bit. Now I need to tackle breathing. Can you play this excerpt all on one breath? You might be able to. I can on good days, but most of the time I choose at least one breath somewhere in the middle. And if you need to take a breath, that's totally fine. You will not be marked bad by taking a breath. You want to practice the breath and set it up properly so that it sounds like you're doing it on purpose. It would be a scary thing to go into it without a breath plan. And then you suddenly take a breath in a really awkward place and it might throw you off. So here are some ideas that you can try and see how they fit. A breath tends to work really well where there's like a shift in the chord or a pattern. So good thing we studied all of those, right? So if you look down below here in yellow, you'll see some ideas. So at the beginning of measure 5, if you play the downbeat, then you could grab a breath after that. That's a shift in chord and it's a shift in the pattern. That's a great place to take a breath. You wouldn't take all of these. Let me make sure I point that out. So you might pick one, maybe two. If you do two of them, I would do the first one and the last one. Otherwise, we look at that second breath in measure 6. Can go nicely just before you have that sort of combo chromatic scale. So you have D, C sharp, D, and then E. Picking up into 7. That's another place where you could breathe. In the middle of measure 8, we have a shift in the pattern and the chord. So we have all these slurs, and then we start this F sharp scale going up. That's also a good place where you could grab a breath. My favorite place to grab the breath is right before the D sharp in measure 12. If you go back and listen to the very beginning where I recorded this, that's where I take my breath. And I set it up by playing those staccato notes at the end of 11 a little bit slower to kind of set up the space and the air to breathe so that it's not sudden and abrupt. We would want to avoid something like this. Instead, by slowing down just slightly at the end of those staccato notes, you set up the breath. And that makes more sense. Let's think about dynamics now. This page is pretty blank. I see one shape marked in measure 15. We have a crescendo, decrescendo marking. Nothing else. But something should happen. So you got to do something, write it in, try some different ideas, and figure out what works best for you. Some ideas, like measure 4, seems like it could be decreasing. It could have a little decrescendo there because measure 5, where we have a chord change, hello, that's why we studied that stuff, feels like something new is starting. So you could build something new starting in measure 5. And then again, measure 11 could decrease, and then there could be a slow build starting in measure 12 where you have all these chord patterns that obviously lead to this big peak on the high A in measure 15 as we come down on that chromatic scale. So really like that high A is a peak moment. I also think measure 3 is a peak area and measure 7 is a peak area. So try some different things, play for friends, play for your teacher, see what works, record yourself, see what seems to make sense. We want to avoid anything that's too up and down too abruptly. So I would avoid things like up for one measure, down for one measure, up for one measure, down for one measure. You can get a little seasick when you do that. So look for a bigger plan. Look for bigger moments that you want to shine. Now for some other practice ideas. Of course, we've already practiced 4+1 and 8+1. That's something I do a lot. But you can get creative with your metronome work, or you could even have a drum groove going. I often like to do that. I'll pick a cool drum groove from YouTube because I get bored really easily. So I want to have something funky and fun to practice to. You can do 5-in-1 method. So like if you pick a tricky spot, so let's say measure 6, that's a tricky spot because we have to have that side key, or maybe we're flip-flopping with the F sharp. So that would be a good place to try 5-in-1. Now, let me explain what 5-in-1 is. I did not invent this, so I don't get credit for it, but I use it a lot. So you take something like measure 6, that's tricky, and you pick a metronome marking. Let's start with 60. You play it 5 times correctly. So if you mess up, you got to start over with the 5s. Play it 5 times, and then bump it up all the way to 84, and you just sort of go for it and see what happens. Then you're going to come back down to 72, and it's going to feel slow because you just did this big go for it at 84. So now you go 72 and you do that 5 times. And then after you get 5 times correctly at 72, you bump it all the way up to 96 and you do another go for it take. And then you bump it down to 84 and you're doing 5 times at 84, which just a few minutes ago seemed incredibly impossible. So it's a great sort of mind game to get around the metronome without this little, like, okay, 1 click faster, 1 click faster, 1 click faster. I prefer to do this 5-in-1 method that has larger leaps in the difference in the metronome. It also helps me to memorize tempos. So I have 60, 72, 84, 96, and so on, plus 12, basically memorized. It's great to feel that and be confident with those metronome markings. All right, so I'm going to do 5-in-1 using measure 6. Now, all of a sudden, 84 feels easy. Another thing I like to practice is the floating long note. You can do this in a 4+1 pattern or in an 8+1 pattern. If you do 4+1, you take the first note in a group of 4 and you say, okay, I'm going to play this first note long and the other 3 will be short. And then you play the second note long and the other notes around it short, and then the third note and the fourth note, etc. The 8+1 idea with this floating long note is the same thing. It's just a bigger stretch, a bigger chore to do. So you start with the first note, it's long, second note's long, third note long, fourth note, fifth note, sixth note, and then everything else around it is quick. I'll do both so you can take a listen of what I'm talking about. So then you can take this idea into measure 2, measure 3, and so on. You can do the 4+1 or the 8+1, or maybe both. Then you can also go back and review where you practice the slurs only, the staccatos only, and just get as creative as you can. You might come up with your own ideas to break things apart and then put it all back together. Now we will move on to Rose 32, number 17, the lyrical one. The suggested tempo is 8th note at 80. You will be very tempted to go faster. Stop that. Your chance to show your musical spirit is with this etude. So this is where you can learn to have a flexible pulse, use a little rubato, but we do want to first learn it very steady with a metronome and subdivide. A general reminder is play very long, full value notes and play through each note. A common tendency with slow etudes like this is the last note of the phrase is sort of choked off and not really played through. Play much longer than you think on the final notes of phrases. Let's listen to my run through on this. All right, now we'll break this one apart a little bit. Trust me, I won't go into as much of a deep dive as I did with the faster etude. So with rhythm, we have lots of things to consider. This is where counting and being precise is going to be very important. Because in the fast etude, it's just can you play steady? So now here, it's can you play rhythmically accurately with good subdivision and then eventually with a little rubato. With the eighth note as the beat, if you think about that as sort of like a quarter note beat, then your 32nd notes will feel like 16th notes. So that's another thing to kind of take into consideration. Another thing that you can try is you can articulate tied notes at first so that you can really feel the pulse. And then the final thing is we would count the notes in the run so that we can choose a grouping. If we just sort of haphazardly play through that run without a plan, it can be harder to figure out, okay, where am I starting? Where am I ending? What am I emphasizing? And we'll go through that too. So now let's think about eighth note as the pulse at 80. With the eighth note beat, things are going to be counted a little differently. So we're going to count all the way up to 8 in a measure. The first note will take up the first 3 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 1, 2, and so on. Pardon my singing, but that's the idea. And what you can do is literally tongue those eighth note pulses to keep you honest with the rhythm. Now we'll look at some tied notes where you can practice tonguing the ties just for a practice tool, and that will help you feel the pulse a little better. The first tie that we have is in measure 3. It's a very simple one because it's an eighth note pulse. So if we look at the pickups and we tongue the tie, it would sound like this. The next ties that I think are a little trickier are in measure 4 and in measure 7. We have a full-size quarter note tied over to 16th notes. So now in this case, I would actually subdivide 16th notes. So we will have 5 16th notes before we move. Now let's take a look at that big chromatic run at the end of the excerpt. We have 25 total notes. When I think about, okay, I want to divide this into groups that will make sense to me. Maybe groups of 3, groups of 4, groups of 6. I think groups of 5 might be a little tough. You could do that if you want to. But if I think about this, we have C, and then a C sharp is the first note of the run, and then a D. And then if you look at where we're headed, the forte is a D. So now I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe I could start this on D and treat the C sharp like a pickup note. So now I have 24 notes to work with instead of 25. So now I have options. I can do groups of 4. I can do groups of 6. I could even do groups of 3 if I want to. But I tend to favor larger groups so I have a bigger chunk to put together. So this is what it would look like with groups of 4. You can mark this in your music. You'll end up with 6 groups of 4. Or you can do it in groups of 6 and you end up with 4 groups of 6. In the recording that I did, the beginning of this section, I was thinking in groups of 6, but most of the time nobody's going to know what you're thinking. And that's okay, as long as it's organized in your own brain and you're leading to that climactic high D really well. So I'll play it both ways a little more obviously, groups of 4 and then groups of 6. For the fingerings in this etude, it's way simpler. So mostly you're going to have your standard choices for fingerings. There are a few places where you could do something different, like maybe the fork B flat, picking up to 3. Some people like that sound, especially when you start on that note. It's a little bit easier to start on the fork fingering. But then watch out, because if you stick with fork, you're going to end up with a tangle. So just make choices, write them in, make sure there's no weird tangle like going from fork B flat down to an F or something. So know when you have to do side and when you can get away with using the fork fingering. The next thing is there is one left C required unless you have the alternate E flat key, and that is in measure 4. So we have F, E flat, D, E flat, and then left side C. We want to avoid that slide unless it's absolutely necessary. Sometimes it is necessary, but in this context, you can use your left C and have a much smoother transition. Of course, if you have the alternate E flat key, you have more choices. Consider using resonance fingerings for your B flat, especially in the 8th note section where it's very exposed. It can be as simple as just having your right hand down along with your B flat fingering. You can also experiment with different combinations. Sometimes for me, 2-3 on the top, 2-3 on the bottom, and the C key along with the B flat fingering creates a really nice warm tone. Unfortunately, going to the side B flat, it's not really a good choice for this etude. So we have to make the best that we can out of that crunchy throat B flat by adding some fingerings and making sure that note sounds as warm as it can sound. As you work in measure 3 with the large leap from F to the high D, the really cool thing about that fingering is you can use something called half hole. So you go from F, and instead of just lifting that finger when we go to the high D, you can slide it downward to where it's only covering half of the hole. And you get a really smooth connection that way. Practice it slowly at first. You can practice it without the pinky at first. You can practice it with the pinky on both notes. And then you can practice just gently squeezing that pinky down as you slide to the half hole. Finally, in measure 8, you have this big chromatic scale leading up to the high D. You have a C sharp before the D, and then you have a D flat after the D. Never, ever, ever put your pinky down for those notes. We can hear it, we can tell. Clarinet people know that sound of the pinky on the C sharp. It makes the note extremely sharp and kind of brittle sounding, so make sure you're very accurate with your fingerings around that high D. For articulation, this is mostly smooth, so legato and as smooth as possible. Think the, ni, or li. Syllables that are very gentle and delicate. When you get to the pickups to 5, that can be a little bit more defined and articulated. And then in the high C in measure 7 and the high D in measure 8, you could slur into those and be kind of sneaky about it. It's better to slur them than to have a big thunk against the reed when you're trying to play really delicately. But still, work on those and see if you can get it to be very smooth. But if all else fails, skipping an articulated note is less of a crime than having a big thunk. So choose on the day of what you're going to do. And of course, I will revisit tuning on this etude. You must be in tune with yourself, practice with your tuner, practice with a drone. Slow music means tuning is more exposed. If you're going to be holding a really flat or a really sharp note for a very long time, it's going to be much more noticeable. So practice with your tuner and your drone, like I said. Figure out your tendencies and mark them in. If a note tends to be sharp, put a little arrow down to remind yourself, okay, bring this down. If a note tends to be flat, put an arrow up to kind of bring it up, raise your eyebrows and think of lifting it. You may need to adjust your instrument. You can pull at your barrel. You can pull in the middle for notes that are around the middle of the clarinet. And just really get used to your tuner and how your clarinet reacts to different ranges, big leaps, and things like that. All right, for breathing on this etude, we want big, relaxed, and quiet breaths. If you take a breath like this, it's kind of loud. So think big, low, quiet, almost like you're getting ready to yawn. We want to have that nice warm approach. For practice, you can practice holding out the ends of phrases as long as you possibly can. That can help build up your lung endurance. And then ideal breaths are marked down here below in yellow. Now the first three are very obvious because it's where we have rests. But that last breath after the first note of measure 8, I take that breath because I don't think I can make it. Pickups to 7 all the way to the end of the etude. That's a pretty big stretch. And to me, leading into measure 8 feels like you're setting up a cadenza or you're setting up a fermata. And the chromatic scale feels like a little miniature cadenza. We get to the high D, it's like we're back to odd tempo. So I think you can have some flexibility in that area. Now, if you get really caught and maybe you take a bad breath in one spot or you need to let go of some air, these red dashes are places where you could take an extra breath or go and let go of your extra air. Sometimes we take a breath that's too big and then it sort of piles on itself, and by the end of the etude, you feel like you're choking. So it's good to have exhale places as well as inhale places. But mostly these red dashes are little emergencies for breathing in or breathing out. After tied notes is usually good. There's a break in the slur in measure 1, measure 4 the tie note, measure 5 in between those half notes, and so on. Pick what you would need maybe as an emergency and maybe put parentheses around them. But these are the places that would make sense. A breath in any other spot might really interrupt the flow of the etude. Now for dynamics. At the bare minimum, you must at least follow what's written on the page. And I say, well, mostly because there's some things that sort of contradict itself. But otherwise, we want to fill in the gaps. So if you think about what's missing, we look at the very beginning, there's a lot of stuff missing. Where's the opening dynamic? What is it? All we know is it's dolce, which means sweet. So, okay, and then we decrescendo, and then we have another decrescendo, and then we have another decrescendo. So are we just constantly getting softer? No, it's just missing a lot of stuff. So think you start kind of in the middle somewhere, you're going to decrease, and then I would say let's increase to the downbeat of measure 2. Because we have an appoggiatura, D, F, E flat is an appoggiatura. We want to bring that F out, and then we're going to decrease. Then the high B flat in measure 2. Start bigger, and then you're going to decrease. And then I think of a long crescendo in those 30-second notes leading to measure 4. What's the dynamic? So you need to choose. Then you're going to decrease. And then you could stay soft, or you could start a little bit bigger on those pickups to 5 and then decrease leading into 5 and then start a crescendo, which is a kind of a nice idea. Then measure 7 is big. So this whole thing leads to measure 7. You could stay big that whole time all the way to the downbeat of measure 8, or you could decrease a little and then increase back. And that's a nice little trick so that you're not just like, yelling the whole time. And then it's kind of obvious on the third line what to do. We're going to have this crescendo up to the high D. But then I would move that decrescendo over to the left a little bit so that I leave room to do a little emphasis leading into that last G at the downbeat of 9, because again, we have another appoggiatura. We've got to bring out those appoggiaturas. So now think about what else could you do, or what would you change? This is sort of your opportunity to make it your own to an extent, right? We don't want to go crazy with it, but we do want to have some shape, some obvious musicality, some expression, something going on so that it's not just blah. Now, once you've got everything really secure, you've got your basics, you've done your subdividing, the notes feel comfortable, your connections are really smooth, you like your shapes and your dynamic choices, now we can add some rubato. We can stretch a little bit. At the bare minimum, make sure your final notes of phrases are very long. Go back and listen to my recording of that. I made sure I played those ends of phrases as long as I could. I like to mimic a singer. We want to be flexible. You can add a little extra love on some notes, which just basically means time. Add a little time on some notes. You have some room to stretch, especially the ends of phrases, and room to push and pull. And that works really well where notes are moving. So if you look at like the end of measure 3, if we play that super metronomically, it's going to totally jump out of character for the piece. But if we think about stretching the beginning of it, maybe moving somewhere in the middle and then stretching at the end of it, it's going to hold the character of the piece. So I'm going to play it very metronomically, and then I'm going to play it with a little rubato, and hopefully you can hear the difference. Just like I would say with the fast etude, with the slow etude, record yourself. Not just for, am I playing the right notes and rhythms, but is it coming across what I'm trying to say? A lot of times we think we're doing something, but you can't really hear it on the recording. So you may have to overdo dynamics, overdo your expressive things like rubato and stretching, and make sure what you think is happening is really happening. Okay, now moving on to the scale requirements for the audition. These are much more important than you might think. The assignment is to tongue up and slur down on the 2 scales, like the major and the minor scales. But I would say let's practice them other ways also. Maybe slur all the way, tongue all the way. And also chromatic is supposed to be all articulated. You could also practice that all slurred. Aim for legato when you are tonguing and avoid that sort of marching band bounce in the sound. And then also work with a metronome or a fun drum track to make things more interesting. All right, let's tackle these scales. I like to slur everything first. That really helps to get the air moving. So let's start with A flat scale. I'm going to go a little slower just because we're practicing right at 80. Now as we get into articulation, I want to think about a legato articulation so that I avoid a sort of staccato or a heavy tongue. And I can practice that where I just work on that first note. So if I think of beat to beat practice on the A flat, I would just articulate A flat, A flat, A flat, A flat, A flat. So 4 total A flats because I'm allowing that first note to be an 8th note. So I'll play that a couple of times and you can play along with me if you'd like. And then I would do beat to beat groups where I'm actually tonguing the moving notes. So first I start by tonguing just one note, and then I tongue all the notes written, but I do beat to beat practice. Okay, So I would take that whole idea through the entire scale, all tongued, and then go back and maybe try the way it's written for the audition, tongued on the way up and slurred on the way down. And yes, show them that you are detailed enough to appreciate that the last note is a whole note. Hold it 1, 2, 3, 4, off, all the way to the beat 1 of the next measure. Then I would practice the same ideas with the B harmonic minor scale. First starting with articulating beat to beat, B, and then beat 2 going E, and then adding the notes so I can practice a consistent articulation when the notes move, which of course makes things tougher. Now with the B minor scale, you want to think about fingerings that you're going to choose. So as you go from A sharp to B and you cross that break, you might choose left B and then right C sharp, or you might choose right side B and then left C sharp. Whatever you decide, keep it consistent when you go up and down. If you change one direction to the other direction, it can get really confusing for your hands and your muscle memory. So pick one, stick with it. If for some reason what you have chosen is sloppy, then choose the other one and give it a try. You might be cleaner with it. So now the final challenge for the audition is the chromatic scale. They are asking you to play full range, your best low note to your best high note, all in eighth notes, play ascending and descending, all articulated both up and down, and the quarter note as the tempo at 104, which makes your eighth note half that speed. So it's kind of a slow requirement, but I think they would just want to hear every single note coming through very cleanly. I would practice slurred first and then articulated. That again helps to keep your air moving and you're following through a little bit better. And then when you choose your range, make sure you're choosing a range that shows off your best playing. Let's say you only choose like E to the high E, 3-octave chromatic. That's perfectly respectful, especially if your tone is nice and even through all of those ranges. If you choose a range that's a little ambitious and you sound weak at the top, that's really not showing your best foot. So yes, of course, work on expanding your range, maybe up to G. G is sort of the standard rep that you might run into for high school level music. So G would be great. If you can go any higher than G, that's really just sort of extra bonus points, but it's gotta sound really good if you're gonna go that high. So first I'll play E chromatic, 3 octaves, slurred first and then tongued. Again, I'm going to think as much legato as I can so I have a smooth articulation and sort of the same air I would have if I were slurring. As you may find, slurring I think is easier on the chromatic scale. So having you articulate that is kind of pure genius. It makes it tougher. You want to really listen for your articulation to be consistent and your tone to be consistent across all the registers. Thank you so much for joining me on this video. I hope it was helpful. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions or if you're interested in private lessons, I am in Colorado now and I'd be happy to take on some more students. My email is clarinetplayground@gmail.com. Also, be sure to check my website, clarinetplayground.com. I write clarinet etudes and fun music for solo and ensemble. Thanks again.